I'm Chelsea, 30 years old, and I used to think the worst thing about family dinners was my mom's overcooked pot roast. I was wrong. The worst part was sitting there listening to her praise my cousin Olivia's perfect life while she tore mine apart. For years I told myself her words didn't hurt. But deep down, every Christmas, every family gathering, every conversation with her was a tiny cut that left a scar. This year at Christmas dinner, my mom said something that finally made the floodgates open. The entire family was watching, waiting for me to break. But this time I didn't. I stood up and I finally fought back. Have you ever felt like you were living a life that wasn't your own? I have. And my story is about how I finally took it back. Let me take you back to where it began. The smell of cinnamon and pine reminds me of my mother's overcooked pot roast. It's always the same. Every Christmas, every Thanksgiving, every single family dinner growing up in our little suburban house in Lexington, Massachusetts. I'm 30 years old now and I still can't escape it. The smell isn't the problem though. The problem is the memory that comes with it. The memory of my mom, Diane, carving that roast at the head of the table while she carved me up in front of everyone who mattered. The polite smiles, the forced laughter. The way I would sit there and nod like a good little girl, as if her words were just as warm as the food she was serving. I remember one Christmas in particular. I must have been 16. My friend Lindsay had given me a leather jacket as an early gift, a style that was so popular back then. I wore it to the family dinner, feeling so cool and confident for the first time in my life. The moment I walked in, my mother's eyes went right to it. She smiled a tight little smile and called me over to where she was talking with my Aunt Carol. "Look at this, Carol," she said, gesturing to me like I was a piece of art in a gallery. "Chelsea thinks she's a rebel now. This is what all the girls are wearing, isn't it? She's certainly not getting it from me." Aunt Carol just looked at the floor, a flicker of pity in her eyes, and I felt the heat rise up my neck. I ran upstairs and changed into my old sweater, the feeling of shame clinging to me like a bad odor. That feeling, that shame, it was my constant companion. Every holiday, every big moment became another opportunity for my mother to remind me and everyone else of my shortcomings. She'd talk about my grades, the boyfriends. I didn't have the college I chose that she thought wasn't good enough. It was a slow drip of poison, one little comment at a time, until my own sense of self was completely washed away. After 4 years of college at the University of New Hampshire, living so far away from her, I started to feel like a real person. I found friends who appreciated me, professors who saw my potential. For a little while, I forgot the girl who always felt she was never quite enough. But then the student loans piled up and moving back home felt like the only option. I took a job as an elementary school teacher at Willow Creek Elementary. I loved my job. My students were kind, my principal, Mr. Thompson, was supportive, and for the first time I felt like I was making a difference. But every family gathering, every trip to the grocery store with my mother, it became another battleground. My mom would introduce me to her friends and say something like, "This is my daughter Chelsea. She's a teacher. I keep telling her she should go back to school to get a real job with more money." She'd say it with a sweet smile, and they'd always look at me with sympathy. A couple of years passed, and nothing changed. My father, Peter, would just sit quietly looking at his plate. He rarely spoke up, but I saw the way his jaw would tighten. He was a good man, but he was passive, a peacemaker at all costs. I understood that he was caught in the middle, but it didn't stop me from resenting him for his silence. I learned to just smile and nod, to pretend her words didn't hurt, but every comment was another crack in the foundation of my self-worth. Just a few days ago the phone rang, and I knew who it was. The ringtone itself, a simple jingle, sounded like an alarm bell to my ears. It was a Monday afternoon and I was home from work. I picked it up, took a deep breath, and heard her voice on the other end, cheerful and sharp at the same time. "Chelsea, it's me," she said. "Are you coming home for Christmas dinner this year? I'm making my famous pot roast." I said I would be there, of course, and she started in right away. "Good. We need to do a little planning. Your Aunt Carol and Uncle Tom are coming, and you know how they are. Everything has to be perfect." I could hear the subtle pressure in her voice, a warning that I had better not mess this up. Then she added a little something extra. I want you to be here on Wednesday. Olivia is coming with her new boyfriend and you two can do all the decorating together. I'm sure you could use a little help from her. She's so good at these things. My stomach dropped. The dread I had been holding back for months came flooding back. Christmas was less than a week away, and the stage was already being set for another public humiliation. I told her I would be there on Wednesday, hung up and just sat on the couch staring at the wall. The fear of what was to come was almost unbearable. I was a 29-year-old woman with a master's degree and a full-time job, and yet the thought of facing my mother's disappointment made my stomach churn. I felt like I was 15 again, waiting for her to come home and find the B+ on my chemistry test. That familiar feeling of dread was my unwelcome passenger, as I packed a small duffel bag, just enough for a few days. My dad called me Wednesday morning, his voice low, as if he was trying not to be overheard. "Chelsea," he said, "your mother has been so busy getting ready for Christmas. She's been so stressed. Just try to be on your best behavior." Okay, I took a deep breath. I'm always on my best behavior, Dad. He didn't say anything to that. He didn't have to. I could hear the worry in his silence. He was a good man, my dad. A quiet man. He loved me, I knew he did. But he had long ago given up on trying to reason with my mother. His form of defense had always been to remain silent, to retreat into himself, and to hope the storms would pass. I knew he was just trying to protect me in the only way he knew how, but it always left me feeling a little bit abandoned. I drove the 40 minutes from my apartment in Boston to my parents' house in Lexington. The trees were bare, the air was crisp, and the familiar New England homes were decorated with wreaths and twinkling lights. It was beautiful, but the beauty felt fake, like a movie set. As I pulled into the driveway, I saw my mother through the kitchen window, moving with a manic energy, arranging plates and polishing glasses. Her movements were always so purposeful, so deliberate. She was a woman who was always in control, or at least she gave that impression. I walked in the front door, the scent of cinnamon and pot roast immediately filling my senses. "I'm here," I called out, setting my bag down by the door. "In the dining room, Chelsea," she said without looking up. She was placing small, ornate name cards at each setting. "You're late. I thought I told you to get here earlier." I looked at my watch. It was exactly 4 o'clock. "The traffic was a little heavy," I said, my voice neutral. She finally looked up, her smile not quite reaching her eyes. "Traffic, of course. Well, no matter. We have so much to do. Come here, help me with these plates. Don't put them too close to the edge. You know how clumsy you are." I fought back the familiar sting of her words. "I'm not clumsy, Mom," I said, trying to keep my voice even. "Oh, Chelsea," she said, letting out a little laugh as she placed a hand on my arm. "Don't be so sensitive. I'm just trying to help. You know you are so much like your Aunt Carol. Everything you say, everything you do, it's always so difficult. That's what your father always tells me anyway." My dad had never said anything of the sort. I knew she was lying, twisting his words to make them sound like they were his. It was a trick she had used my whole life. I just stood there holding a stack of fine china plates, my mind reeling. My mom went on, "Your cousin Olivia is going to be here soon. She's bringing her new boyfriend. He's a wonderful young man, an investment banker in New York. We're all so excited to meet him. I just hope you don't say anything to embarrass us in front of him." I felt my jaw clench. "I'm not going to embarrass you, Mom." She just sighed, a theatrical sigh that was meant to make me feel small. "Let's hope not. Now go put your bag upstairs and then we can get to work on the tree. Oh, and for goodness sake, put a little lipstick on. You look a little washed out." I didn't say a word. I just went upstairs, my heart thumping in my chest. I walked into my old room, the one I had left years ago, and saw it was exactly the same. The same floral wallpaper, the same bedspread, the same old books on the shelf. Everything was frozen in time, and I felt as if I was being pulled back into the person I used to be. I sat on the bed for a moment, just breathing, trying to get my thoughts together. Then I saw it. On the dresser under my old jewelry box was a small white envelope. My name, Chelsea, was written on it in my father's familiar, careful handwriting. I picked it up, opened it, and found a check for $3,000. Below the check, a small note. It was just a few words, but it hit me like a ton of bricks. It said, "This is for you, my sweet daughter. Don't let her dim your light. Love, Dad." The familiar words my dad always called me his sweet daughter. My heart ached, but it wasn't a feeling of sadness. It was a feeling of love. A quiet, unspoken love that had been there all along. A love that I hadn't noticed or hadn't been able to see until now. The fear and the shame that had been building inside me for days, for years, seemed to lift just a little. It was just a small note, but in that moment, it felt like the most precious gift I had ever received. That check and the note were more than just money. They were a whisper in the dark, a tiny bit of hope that not everyone had given up on me. It was a secret between my dad and me. I tucked it into my wallet, the paper crinkling softly, and felt a tiny bit of strength return to my bones. I put on a little lipstick like my mom had suggested, not for her, but for me. I wanted to look like the confident woman I was trying to be, not the scared little girl I felt like inside. I went back downstairs, ready to face the music. My mom had already moved on to arranging the ornaments on the tree. "There you are," she said, her back to me. "I thought you got lost up there. Start with the lights. Don't let them get tangled this year." I just nodded and went to the box of lights. I untangled them slowly, my mind drifting back to when I met Jason. It was a couple of years after I moved back home. I was teaching at Willow Creek Elementary, and he was an engineer working for a tech company in Boston. We met at a coffee shop, and our connection was immediate and real. For the first time, I felt seen for who I was, not for what my mom wanted me to be. Jason was kind, smart, and he laughed at my jokes. He never tried to change me. He told me he loved my passion for teaching and that my students were lucky to have me. Our relationship was everything I had always wanted, but my mom Diane saw it as a problem. She would ask me questions about his salary, his family background, his car. The more she asked, the more I knew she was disappointed. A teacher and an engineer, Chelsea. That's nice, I suppose. But don't you think you could do better? What about a lawyer, a doctor, a dentist? I told her I was happy, but my happiness didn't seem to matter to her. She wanted me to have a life that she could brag about, not a life that I could enjoy. It all came to a head at a barbecue at Jason's parents' house a few months into our relationship. His parents, Linda and Robert, were so warm and welcoming. We were all sitting outside on their deck, laughing and eating burgers when my mom turned to Linda. "So Linda," she said with a sweet smile, "how does it feel to know that your son, an engineer, has to pay for everything while my daughter, a mere teacher, just sits back and gets a free ride? I wish my daughter would find a man who could take care of her." The whole table went silent. Linda's smile faltered, and Robert just looked at my dad, who was staring at his plate. I felt the hot, familiar sting of shame. I wanted to disappear. Jason, sensing my distress, put a hand on my knee under the table. He said something about how he loved my ambition and that we were a team. But the damage had been done. After that day, our relationship was never the same. A few weeks later, we broke up. I was heartbroken. I cried for days. He told me he couldn't continue to be with me when my own mother treated me so poorly. "I can't watch her do that to you, Chelsea," he said. "You're a wonderful person, but she's never going to let you be yourself." It's a sad truth, but it's the truth. He was right. My own mother had sabotaged the one thing that made me truly happy. I came back to the present moment. The tangle of lights in my hand felt symbolic of the knot in my heart. My mother, still focused on the tree, turned to me. "Chelsea, what's taking you so long? Get a move on. We don't have all day." I didn't say anything. I just kept untangling the memories of Jason's words, replaying in my mind. He was right. My mom had held me back my entire life. She was always going to be there, trying to control me, trying to change me into the person she wanted me to be. My own life had become a series of failed relationships and disappointments, all orchestrated by her. I had to do something. I had to find a way to get out from under her thumb. It was then that a tiny seed of an idea began to take root in my mind. A seed of revenge, a feeling I had never allowed myself to feel before. It was a little scary, but it was also the most powerful feeling I had ever had. My plan wasn't about being mean or spiteful. It was about standing up for myself. It was about showing everyone, but most importantly myself, that I was not the person my mother had spent my entire life telling me I was. I was a professional, an adult, and a good person, and it was about time everyone saw that. The next morning I woke up with a sense of purpose I hadn't felt in years. I got dressed, put on a fresh face of makeup, and went downstairs to start the day. My dad was already at the kitchen table reading the newspaper. He looked up at me and gave me a small, knowing smile. He knew something was different about me. The weight on my shoulders felt a little lighter, and for the first time, I felt like I was in control. I started to reflect on my journey. I wasn't always this insecure, this quiet. I had dreams, hopes, and ambitions. I was always a good student, a hard worker, and a kind person. But my mother's constant criticism had chipped away at my confidence little by little until there was almost nothing left. I remember being 7 years old at a parent-teacher conference with my mother at my elementary school. My teacher, Mrs. Jenkins, had told my mom I was a gifted writer and that she was so proud of me. My mom just smiled and nodded, but then she said, "She's just so careless, Mrs. Jenkins. Her handwriting is so messy. I don't know where she gets it from." I felt my stomach drop, and I knew right then and there that nothing I did would ever be good enough. Even in high school, it was the same. I was a good student with an A average, but I wasn't the star athlete or the prom queen. My mom would always say, "It's a shame you didn't work harder in high school. Look at what Olivia is doing. She's a straight A student, and she's a cheerleader. Don't you think you should try to be more like her?" My mom didn't care about my grades. She cared about me being a replica of Olivia. It was exhausting, and I just wanted to be myself. My dad, bless his heart, would try to stand up for me every once in a while, but his efforts were always futile. One time, he tried to tell my mom to stop comparing me to Olivia, and she just laughed. "Peter, I'm just trying to help her. If she doesn't learn from her mistakes, she's never going to succeed. Don't you want our daughter to be a success?" My dad didn't say anything. He just looked at me with a sad, empty look in his eyes. I graduated from high school and went to the University of New Hampshire. For the first time I was free. Free from my mom, free from her constant criticism, free from the shadow of my cousin Olivia. I thrived. I made friends, I got good grades, and I found a passion for teaching. I was happy, truly happy. But the student loans piled up, and I knew that the only way to pay them off was to move back home. It was supposed to be a temporary solution, just a few years, but it had turned into an eternity. I found a job as an elementary school teacher at Willow Creek Elementary. I loved my job. My students were kind, my principal, Mr. Thompson, was supportive, and for the first time I felt like I was making a difference. I got a little apartment a few miles from my parents' house. I was making a life for myself, a life I was proud of. But my mom, Diane, would not let it go. Every family gathering, every trip to the grocery store with my mother, it became another battleground. My mom would introduce me to her friends and say something like, "This is my daughter Chelsea. She's a teacher." I keep telling her she should go back to school to get a real job with more money. She'd say it with a sweet smile, and they'd always look at me with sympathy. I finally had enough. My best friend Hannah told me to stand up for myself. "You're a grown woman, Chelsea. Your mother has no right to treat you this way. You have to stand up for yourself. You have to tell her that you've had enough." I knew she was right, but the thought of confronting my mother was terrifying. I knew what she was capable of. I knew she would just turn it around on me, make me feel like I was the problem. I wasn't ready to go to war, not yet. But as I thought about what was to come, about the Christmas dinner, about Olivia and her new boyfriend, I knew it was time. I had to do it. The memory of my dad's note, the one that told me not to let her dim my light, gave me the courage I needed. It was time to shine. That morning, a quiet resolve settled over me. The fear was still there, but it was overshadowed by a new, more powerful feeling, a sense of purpose. I was no longer just the person who lived at home and taught elementary school. I was a woman on a mission. I was going to find my own voice. The first step was to take back control of my own life. It started small. I began looking for a new apartment, something I hadn't done in years. I had the money from my dad's check, and I was going to use it to get out from under my mom's thumb. I had a few $100s saved up, and I knew it was enough for a deposit. It felt like a giant leap, a monumental act of defiance. I was also focused on my work. My students were my safe haven, and my principal, Miss Thompson, was my biggest cheerleader. A few months ago, he had nominated me for the Teacher of the Year award. I was shocked and honored. I worked hard. I spent my nights and weekends planning new lessons, creating new projects, and doing everything in my power to make my classroom a fun and engaging place for my students. I loved my job, and my students' laughter and smiles were the only validation I ever needed. The awards ceremony was held at the district office in downtown Boston, a beautiful brick building with large windows and a grand staircase. I was so nervous, but Mr. Thompson was there, and he gave me a hug and a pep talk. "You deserve this, Chelsea," he said. "You're one of the best teachers I've ever had. You're a natural." When my name was called as the winner, my heart soared. I walked up to the stage, my head held high, and accepted the plaque. I gave a short speech thanking my students and Mr. Thompson for their support. It was a moment of pure, unadulterated happiness. I felt like I was floating on a cloud. I couldn't wait to tell my family. I called my mom on the drive home, my voice shaking with excitement. "Mom, you won't believe what happened," I said, my voice full of joy. "I won the Teacher of the Year award." There was a long pause on the other end of the line. I could hear her breathing, but she didn't say anything. The silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Finally, she spoke, her voice flat and emotionless. "Oh, that's nice, Chelsea. I'm happy for you." She said it as if she were talking about the weather. "Well, I have to go now. I have to get ready for your father's cousin's wedding. I'll see you at home." She hung up before I could say anything else. My heart sank. The joy I had felt just moments before was gone, replaced by a familiar feeling of disappointment and hurt. I was so naive. I had thought that this award would be enough for her. I had thought that this would finally make her proud of me. But it didn't. It wasn't enough. It never would be. She had a way of taking my triumphs and turning them into failures. She had a way of taking my happiness and turning it into pain. When I got home, she was already gone, but a small note was on the kitchen counter, written in her perfectly neat handwriting. "Don't forget to take the roast out of the freezer." It was as if the phone call had never happened. I just stood there, the plaque in my hand, the weight of her indifference crushing me. I put the plaque in my room, not wanting to see it anymore. I had worked so hard for that award, and she had just dismissed it. I knew then that I could never get the validation I so desperately wanted from her. I had to find it within myself. I had to learn to be enough for me. It was a hard lesson to learn, but it was a necessary one. That's when I decided that the next time she tried to humiliate me, I wasn't going to let her. I was going to stand up for myself. I was going to fight back. I was going to make her see that I was not the little girl she thought I was. I was a woman, and I was going to be heard. I knew the moment would come at Christmas dinner. It was going to be a battle, but I was ready for it. I was going to win. The week leading up to Christmas Day felt like a countdown to a war. I spent my days at my parents' house, helping my mother with the last-minute preparations, and the tension between us was a living, breathing thing. Every time she looked at me, I felt her disapproval, and I knew she was waiting for me to slip up, to say or do something that would give her the ammunition she needed to fire the first shot. I was ready, though. My courage was like a shield, and I was not going to let her words penetrate it. My dad, Peter, saw the change in me. He would give me little nods of encouragement when my mom wasn't looking, a small smile that told me he was on my side. His quiet support was the fuel I needed to keep my resolve strong. On Christmas Day, the air was cold and clear, and a fresh blanket of snow covered the ground. The house was filled with the smell of cinnamon and pine and the sound of Christmas carols. It all looked and sounded like the perfect Hallmark movie, but I knew better. I knew that beneath the surface a storm was brewing. I was wearing a simple black dress, and I had my hair up in a bun. I felt confident. I felt strong. and I was ready to face whatever came my way. The guests started to arrive at around 5 o'clock. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Tom were the first to show up, and they gave me a big hug. My aunt pulled me aside and said, "Your mother has been so busy getting ready for this. I've never seen her so frantic. Just be patient with her, okay?" I just smiled and nodded, a little bit sad that my own family was so conditioned to be on her side. My cousin Olivia arrived next with her new boyfriend in tow. His name was Andrew, and he was tall, handsome, and looked like he had stepped out of a magazine. Olivia was wearing a beautiful red dress, and she looked so happy. She gave me a hug, and she said, "I'm so glad you're here, Chelsea. I can't wait to catch up with you." I felt a pang of jealousy, but I pushed it down. Olivia had never done anything to hurt me. She was just living her life. It wasn't her fault that my mom used her as a weapon against me. My mom, Diane, was in her element. She was a gracious host, smiling and laughing, making sure everyone had a drink and a plate of appetizers. She introduced Andrew to everyone, talking about his successful career as an investment banker in New York. She was so proud, and I knew she was waiting for the perfect moment to throw her first jab at me. We all sat down at the dinner table at around 6 o'clock. The table was beautiful with my mom's fine china and silver. She had a centerpiece made of fresh pine and holly, and the candles were flickering, casting a warm glow on everyone's faces. We said grace, and then my mom started to carve the roast. The conversation was light, at first everyone talking about their jobs and their kids and their plans for the new year. I just listened, taking it all in, waiting. Then my mom turned to me, her smile a little too bright. "So Chelsea," she said, her voice a little louder than before, "how is teaching at Willow Creek Elementary? Are you still enjoying it?" I knew this was it. The first question. The first volley. I took a deep breath. "It's wonderful, Mom. I love my students, and I'm so passionate about what I do." She just nodded, and then she turned to Olivia, her smile even wider. "Olivia, honey, tell everyone about your new promotion. And your new car. She's so successful, everyone. She works so hard. I'm so proud of her. She's a real go-getter." I just sat there, my heart thumping in my chest. I knew she was doing it on purpose. She was trying to make me feel small. She was trying to make me feel like I was nothing compared to my cousin. And for a moment, I almost gave in. I almost let her words get to me. But then I looked at my dad, and I saw him look at me with that small, knowing look in his eyes. He was telling me that I could do it. He was telling me to be strong. My mom was still talking about Olivia, but her eyes were on me. She was waiting for me to react. She was waiting for me to get emotional, to get upset. She was waiting for me to show everyone that I was still the same fragile girl she had spent her entire life trying to break. But I wasn't that girl anymore. I was a woman, and I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her ruin this Christmas for me. The words she was saying seemed to fade into the background. I was just focused on myself. I was focused on the strength I had. I was focused on the fact that I was not alone. The support I had from my father, my best friend, and my principal, it was all I needed. I was a good person, and I was going to be heard. I knew this was my chance. I was going to do it. I was going to stand up for myself. The time was right now. I had been a passenger in my own life for so long, and I was tired of it. I was ready to take the wheel, to drive myself away from the pain and the shame that had been my constant companions. The moment was right now. My mother Diane was still going on about Olivia's achievements. She talked about her new car, a sleek black sedan, and the new house she and her boyfriend were planning to buy in Connecticut. My mother looked at Olivia with so much pride, so much admiration, and then she looked at me with disappointment. It was a look I knew so well, a look that told me I was nothing compared to my cousin. The rest of the family was just sitting there silently, watching the whole thing unfold. My Aunt Carol and Uncle Tom were looking at their plates, pretending they didn't hear a thing. My dad Peter was just staring at me with that small, sad look in his eyes. He knew what was coming, and he couldn't do anything about it. I felt a surge of anger, a fire that had been burning inside me for years, finally getting out of control. My mother's voice was getting louder, her words sharper, and I knew I couldn't just sit there anymore. "She's a real go-getter, everyone," my mother said, her voice filled with pride. "She's so successful and she works so hard. I'm so proud of her. I just wish my daughter would be more like her." She said it with a sweet smile, and I felt my jaw clench. That was it. I had had enough. I took a deep breath, and I looked at my mother. I looked her straight in the eye, and I didn't say anything. I just stood up from my chair, the scraping sound of the wood on the floor making everyone look at me. The whole room went silent. Everyone stopped what they were doing, and they just stared at me. My mother's smile faltered, and she looked at me, a little bit of surprise in her eyes. She wasn't expecting this. She was expecting me to just sit there and take it, to let her words hurt me, to let her win. But I wasn't going to let her win. Not anymore. I took another deep breath and I spoke. My voice was calm, clear, and steady. It was a voice I didn't even recognize. "Mom," I said, "I have to ask you to stop." My voice was a little shaky, but I didn't care. "I've had enough. I can't do this anymore." My mother's eyes widened, and her mouth fell open. She was so shocked she couldn't even speak. The whole room was silent. You could have heard a pin drop. Then my mother's face hardened and she put on a fake smile. "Chelsea," she said, her voice filled with a fake sweetness. "What are you talking about? It's Christmas dinner. You're making a scene. You're embarrassing me in front of the whole family." That's when it happened. That's when the fire inside me exploded. The words I had been holding back for years, the words I had been so scared to say, just poured out of me. I looked at her and I said, "If I'm such an embarrassment, maybe it's time everyone sees who should really be ashamed tonight." My voice was loud, clear, and steady. It was a voice that commanded attention, a voice that was not going to be silenced. My mother's face went white. She was completely shocked. The whole family was just staring at me in complete shock. My dad looked at me with so much pride in his eyes, and I knew I had done the right thing. I had finally stood up for myself. I had finally found my voice. I looked at my mother and I knew that this was the moment of truth. This was the moment I had been waiting for my entire life. I had to continue. I had to tell everyone the truth. I had to expose her for what she was, a woman who had spent her entire life tearing me down, a woman who had spent her entire life making me feel like I was nothing. I was no longer afraid of her. I was no longer afraid of her words. I was no longer afraid of her disapproval. I was free. The room was so quiet you could hear the soft hum of the Christmas lights and the faint crackle of the fire in the fireplace. Everyone was just staring at me, their eyes wide, with a mixture of shock and disbelief. My mother's face was a mask of pure fury. I could see the anger in her eyes, a deep burning fire that I had never seen before. She was so used to being in control, so used to having the final say, and my words had taken all of that away from her. The power had shifted, and she didn't know what to do. I took a deep breath and I looked around the table. I saw my Aunt Carol and Uncle Tom, their faces a mix of confusion and pity. I saw my cousin Olivia, who was just staring at me with a look of pure shock on her face. Her new boyfriend Andrew was looking at her, then at me, then back at her, trying to figure out what was going on. My father Peter was just sitting there looking at me with so much pride in his eyes. He gave me a small nod, a silent sign of his approval, and I knew I had done the right thing. I turned my attention back to my mother, and I spoke. My voice was calm, clear, and steady. It was the voice of a woman who was no longer afraid. "You said I was an embarrassment, Mom," I said, my voice cutting through the silence. "But what's embarrassing is the way you've treated me my entire life. What's embarrassing is the way you've always compared me to Olivia, the way you've always made me feel like I was a failure. What's embarrassing is the way you've sabotaged my relationships, the way you've laughed at my dreams, the way you've made me feel like I was nothing." My mother's eyes were filled with tears now, but I knew they were tears of anger, not tears of sadness. She opened her mouth to speak, but I didn't let her. I just kept going. "You've always told me that you were doing it for my own good. But that's a lie. You were doing it for yourself. You were doing it because you wanted to feel like a better mother. You were doing it because you wanted to have something to brag about. But guess what? I'm not a failure. I'm a successful teacher. I'm a good person. I'm a kind person. I'm a person who deserves to be happy, and you have no right to take that away from me." My mother just sat there, her mouth open, her eyes wide with shock. She had never heard me talk like this before. She had never seen this side of me. She was so used to having all the power, and I had taken it all away from her. The whole family was just staring at me in complete shock. You could have heard a pin drop. Then my dad stood up from his chair. He walked over to me, and he put his hand on my shoulder. "She's right," he said, his voice quiet but firm. "Chelsea is right. Diane, you've spent her entire life tearing her down. You've always compared her to Olivia, and it's not fair. It's not right. You've made her feel like she's nothing, and she's not. She's a good person. She's a good daughter. She's a good teacher. She's a good woman." My mother just stared at him, her eyes wide with shock. She had never heard him talk like this before. She had never seen him stand up to her before. My dad was a man who always stayed out of the way, who always let her have her way, but not anymore. He had finally found his voice, and he was using it to defend me. I felt a surge of love for him, a deep, powerful love that I had never felt before. The words continued to pour out of me. It was like a dam had broken, and all the pain and anger and frustration I had been holding back for years came flooding out. "I'm not the person you think I am, Mom," I said. "I'm a woman who has found her voice. I'm a woman who is no longer afraid of you. I'm a woman who is going to be happy, and you're not going to stop me." I looked around the table again, and I saw the pity in their eyes, and it didn't hurt anymore. I had finally found my voice, and I was going to use it to be happy. The tears were streaming down my face now, but they were tears of relief, not tears of sadness. I had finally done it. I had finally stood up for myself. I was finally free. I was free of her control, her manipulation, her disapproval. I was free. I had taken back my power, and it felt like the most wonderful thing in the world. I was ready to start a new life. A life on my own terms, a life where I was in control. It was the best Christmas gift I could have ever given myself. The moment felt like a turning point, not just for me, but for my entire family. I had been so used to the silence, to the unspoken rules of our family gatherings, but now everything was out in the open. My mother's face was a mixture of shock and anger, but it was my father's expression that truly moved me. He was standing there, his hand on my shoulder, a small smile on his face, a smile that told me he was proud of me. For the first time in my life, I felt seen by him. He was no longer a silent observer, but an active participant in my life. The rest of the family was just staring at me, a mixture of shock and awe on their faces. They didn't know what to say, what to do. They had been so used to my mother being in control, so used to her words being the only ones that mattered, but now I had taken that power away from her. I took a deep breath, and I looked at my mother. I could see the tears in her eyes now, but I knew they were tears of frustration, not of sadness. She had lost control, and she didn't know how to handle it. She had spent her entire life building up this image of the perfect family, and I had just shattered it in front of everyone. The silence in the room was deafening. No one dared to speak, not even my mother. The power had shifted, and I was holding all the cards. I wasn't going to let her win. Not anymore. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice quiet but firm. "I'm sorry that this had to happen, but I can't do this anymore. I can't let you treat me this way. I deserve to be happy, and I deserve to be respected." My mother just stared at me, her eyes filled with a mixture of anger and disbelief. She didn't know how to respond. She had never been in this situation before. She was always the one who had the last word, the one who was in control, but now she had nothing. The whole family was just sitting there, watching, waiting for her to say something, to do something, but she just sat there defeated. My father Peter squeezed my shoulder, a silent sign of his support. He was standing with me, and I knew that was all I needed. I had my father's support, and that was more than enough. The dinner ended a few minutes later with everyone leaving in a hurry. They all gave me a hug and told me that they would call me later. My Aunt Carol came up to me, her eyes filled with tears, and she gave me a long hug. "I'm so proud of you, Chelsea," she whispered in my ear. "I've always wanted to do that, but I just never had the courage." I just smiled and hugged her back. My cousin Olivia gave me a hug and she said, "I'm so sorry, Chelsea. I never knew she was so mean to you." "I'm so sorry." Her new boyfriend Andrew just gave me a nod, a silent sign of his support. He had witnessed the whole thing and I knew he was on my side. After everyone had left, my mother just sat at the table staring at her plate. My father went over to her and he put his hand on her shoulder. "Diane," he said, his voice quiet, "we need to talk." She just shook her head and she stood up from the table and went upstairs. I looked at my father and he just shook his head. "I'm so sorry, honey," he said. "I should have stood up for you a long time ago." I just went to him and hugged him. "It's okay, Dad," I said. "You're here now." That night I just sat in my room thinking about what had happened. I had finally done it. I had finally stood up for myself. I had finally found my voice. But I knew this was just the beginning. The battle wasn't over. My mother was still my mother, and I knew she wasn't going to give up. I knew she was going to fight back. I knew she was going to try to get me back under her control. But I wasn't going to let her. I was a woman now. I was a person who had found her voice, and I wasn't going to let anyone take that away from me. I was a person who was going to be happy, and I wasn't going to let anyone stop me. I was a person who was going to be free, and I was going to fight for my freedom. The next morning, I woke up with a sense of purpose. I was going to do it. I was going to find a way to get out from under my mom's thumb. I was going to start a new life. A life on my own terms, a life where I was in control, a life where I was happy. I was going to do it for myself. I was going to do it for my dad. I was going to do it for all the people who had ever been silenced. I was going to do it for all the people who had ever felt like they were nothing. I was going to do it. I had finally done it. I had said my piece and I had taken back my power. But the battle was far from over. My mom was still my mom, and I knew she wasn't just going to give up. The next morning, the house was silent. My mom was nowhere to be seen, and my dad was just sitting at the kitchen table drinking his coffee, staring out the window. He didn't say anything, and I didn't either. The silence was thick and heavy, a physical weight in the air. I knew he was thinking about what had happened last night, and I knew he was proud of me. I just went to him and gave him a hug, and he squeezed me tight. We didn't need words, we just understood each other. A few minutes later, the doorbell rang. I went to open it, and it was my Aunt Carol. Her face was a mask of concern, and she gave me a long hug. "I just wanted to check on you, honey," she said, her voice quiet. "I'm so proud of you. I've always wanted to do that, but I just never had the courage." I smiled and thanked her, and I asked her to come in. She went to the kitchen and sat down with my dad, and they started to talk about what had happened. I just listened, and I heard my dad tell her that he was so proud of me, that he had never seen me so strong before. My Aunt Carol just nodded and said, "I know, it's about time." Then she turned to me. "Chelsea," she said, her voice quiet, "I have to tell you something. Something about your mother." I felt my heart pound in my chest. I knew there was something more to her story. I knew there was something that I didn't know. My aunt took a deep breath and she started to talk. "Your mother, Diane, she had a very difficult childhood. Her mother, your grandmother, was a very critical woman. She was always telling your mother that she wasn't good enough, that she wasn't smart enough, that she wasn't pretty enough. She was a very controlling woman, and she never gave your mother any love, any affection." I just sat there in complete shock. I had never heard this before. I had never known that my grandmother was like that. I had only ever known her as a kind, gentle woman who always had a smile on her face. But my Aunt Carol was telling me a different story. A story of a woman who was just like my mother. A woman who was so controlling, so critical, that she had torn my mother down. "Your mother tried so hard to be perfect," my aunt said. "She was always trying to please her mother, but she could never do it. Her mother always found something to criticize, something to complain about. It was a vicious cycle, and your mother never got out of it. She became her mother. The words hit me like a ton of bricks. I just sat there in complete shock. My mother, the woman who had spent her entire life tearing me down, was just like her own mother. She had become the person she had hated. She had become the person who had hurt her so much. I felt a surge of emotions now, a mixture of sadness and anger. I was so angry at my grandmother for what she had done to my mother, for what she had done to me. But I was also so sad for my mother. She had never known what it felt like to be loved unconditionally. She had never known what it felt like to be a person who was enough. She had just spent her entire life trying to be perfect, but she had never been able to do it. My Aunt Carol just looked at me, her eyes filled with tears. "I'm so sorry, Chelsea," she said. "I should have told you a long time ago. But your mother, she never wanted anyone to know. She was so ashamed. She never wanted anyone to know what she had been through." I just sat there, my mind reeling. The whole story, the whole puzzle, it all came together now. I finally understood why my mother was the way she was. I finally understood why she had been so cruel to me. She had been a victim herself. She had been a victim of a vicious cycle of emotional abuse. I felt a pang of sympathy for her now, but it didn't change what she had done to me. It didn't change the fact that she had torn me down. It didn't change the fact that she had made me feel like I was nothing. I just sat there, my mind reeling, trying to process everything. The battle wasn't just about me anymore. It was about a vicious cycle of abuse that had been passed down from generation to generation. It was about a family that was broken, and it was up to me to fix it. I was going to do it. I was going to find a way to break the cycle. I was going to do it for myself, for my mother, for my father, and for my future. I was going to find a way to heal my family. It was going to be a long and difficult journey, but I was ready for it. The next few days were the most difficult of my life. The house was silent, a thick, heavy silence that felt like a physical weight in the air. My mother, Diane, was a ghost, a presence that was there but not really there. She would walk around the house, doing her chores, cooking her meals, but she wouldn't say a word to me. She wouldn't even look at me. The silence was her way of punishing me, her way of making me feel guilty for what I had done. But I wasn't going to let her win. I wasn't going to let her silence break me. I was a woman who had found her voice, and I wasn't going to be silenced again. On Wednesday morning, my dad, Peter, came into my room. He was carrying 2 mugs of coffee, and he handed one to me. "We need to talk," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I nodded, and we went to the kitchen and sat at the table. He took a deep breath, and he said, "Your mother, she won't talk to me. She just walks away. She won't look at me, and she won't say a word. I don't know what to do." I looked at him, and I saw the pain in his eyes. He was a man who had always been so strong, so quiet, but now he was so vulnerable. I knew I had to be the strong one now. "Dad," I said, my voice quiet but firm, "you have to give her a choice. Either she talks to us and goes to therapy with us, or I'm moving out. I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore." My dad just stared at me, his eyes wide with shock. He had never heard me talk like this before. He had never seen me so strong, so determined. He was so used to me being the quiet one, the one who just sat there and took it, but I wasn't that person anymore. "Chelsea, I don't know if she'll agree," he said, his voice a little bit shaky. "She has to," I said. "She has to, or I'm gone. I'm moving out at the end of the month." I knew it was a risk, a big risk, but I also knew it was the only way. I had to set a boundary. I had to show her that I was serious. I had to show her that I was no longer a little girl who was afraid of her. A few minutes later, my mom came into the kitchen. She just walked in, her face a blank mask, and went to the refrigerator. My dad took a deep breath, and he said, "Diane, we need to talk." She just shook her head, and she tried to walk away, but he stopped her. "No, Diane, not this time. We need to talk. We need to talk about what happened." My mom just stood there, her back to us, her body tense. My dad took a deep breath, and he said, "Chelsea gave us an ultimatum. Either you go to therapy with us, or she's moving out. I can't do this anymore. I can't live like this anymore. We need to fix this. We need to heal our family." My mom just stood there silent. I thought she was going to refuse. I thought she was going to walk away, but she didn't. She just stood there, her body tense, her back to us. My dad went to her and he put his hand on her shoulder. "Please, Diane," he said, his voice quiet, "please." My mom just stood there for a few more minutes, and then she turned around. Her face was a mask of anger and sadness, and the tears were streaming down her face. "I'm not a bad person," she said, her voice a whisper. "I'm not a bad person. I don't know how to be a mother. My mother, she was so cruel to me. She was so critical. She never told me she loved me. She never told me I was good enough. I just thought I was doing the right thing. I just thought I was making you strong. I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry." I just went to her and gave her a hug, and she just cried in my arms. She was a mother who had spent her entire life trying to be perfect, but she had never been able to do it. She had just spent her entire life trying to be the person her own mother wanted her to be, but she had never been able to do it. She was a victim herself, and I finally understood. I just hugged her and I told her that it was okay, that we would be okay. We would be a family again. A family that was healed. A family that was whole. It was going to be a long and difficult journey, but we were going to do it together. The next day we made an appointment with a family therapist and we went together. It was the first step on a long and difficult journey, but it was a journey we were all willing to take. We were finally on our way to healing. The therapy sessions were not easy. The first few weeks were filled with angry words and painful tears, with years of unspoken resentment finally coming to the surface. My mother was resistant at first, still clinging to the belief that she had done nothing wrong. But our therapist, Dr. Ellis, was patient and kind. She helped my mom see that her intentions may have been good, but her methods were abusive. She helped my mother understand that her own childhood trauma had shaped her into a person she never wanted to be. For the first time in my life, I saw my mother as a human being, not just a symbol of my pain. I saw a woman who had been hurt, who had never known what it felt like to be loved unconditionally, and who had spent her entire life trying to be perfect. She was a victim just like me. It didn't excuse what she had done, but it helped me understand her, and it helped me begin to forgive her. My father, Peter, was a rock throughout the entire process. He was quiet, but his presence was a source of strength for both of us. He would hold my mom's hand when she cried, and he would give me a hug after every session, a silent sign of his love and support. He was finally finding his voice, and it was a beautiful thing to see. After 6 months of therapy, our family was a different family. We were still a work in progress, but we were on the right track. My mom had apologized to me, not just for what she had said and done at Christmas dinner, but for her entire life. She told me that she was so proud of me, that she had always been proud of me, and that she was so sorry for all the pain she had caused me. It was a moment I had been waiting for my entire life, and when it finally happened, I just cried. I cried for the little girl who had never heard those words, and I cried for the woman who was finally hearing them. I had also made some changes in my own life. I had moved into my own apartment in Boston, a beautiful little place with a big window that looked out on the city. I was still teaching at Willow Creek Elementary, but I was also taking a pottery class on the weekends. I had always wanted to be an artist, and I was finally doing it. I had a new relationship too, with a wonderful man named Ryan, an architect. He was kind and supportive, and he loved me for who I was, not for what I could be. He was nothing like Jason, and he was everything I had ever wanted. My mom loved him, and it was a strange and wonderful thing to see. She would always talk about how kind and gentle he was, and she would always tell me how happy she was for me. It was a beautiful thing to see, and I knew that our family was finally on the road to healing. I had found my voice, and I had found my courage. I had stood up for myself, and I had changed my life. I had gone from being a victim to being a survivor, and it was the best feeling in the world. I had taken back my power, and I was never going to let it go. My mom and I still had our moments, of course. Old habits die hard. But now, when she says something critical, I don't just sit there and take it. I set a boundary. I say, "Mom, that's not okay," and she respects it. The journey isn't over. Therapy continues. Boundaries require constant maintenance, and old patterns try to resurface during times of stress. But I know now that I have a voice, and I know how to use it. I know that my worth isn't determined by someone else's opinion of my choices, even if that someone is my mother. Most importantly, I know that speaking up for yourself isn't selfish or disrespectful. It's necessary. It's the foundation of every healthy relationship, including the one you have with yourself. Have you ever had to stand up to someone you love because they were treating you poorly? Have you struggled with family members who seem to criticize everything you do? I'd love to hear your stories in the comments below. Sometimes sharing our experiences helps others find the courage to set their own boundaries. If this story resonated with you, please give it a like and subscribe for more real-life stories about finding your voice and creating healthier relationships. Share this video with someone who might need to hear that they deserve to be treated with respect, no matter who's doing the treating. Thank you for listening to my story. Remember that you have the right to be treated with kindness and respect by everyone in your life, including family members. Setting boundaries isn't about hurting people you love. It's about loving yourself enough to insist on being treated well. Take care of yourselves, and I'll see you in the next video.